Chapter 1. The journey begins. Rebecca adjusted her backpack and tightened her grip on the trekking poles, her breath visible in the cold, crisp air of the Blackthorn Mountains. The trail leading to Firewatch Tower 17 was steep and treacherous, winding through dense forests and up rocky inclines. The ranger station at the base of the mountain had warned her about the isolation of this particular post, but Rebecca craved the solitude it offered. She needed time away from the chaos of city life, time to think and find herself again. As she climbed higher, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The forest around her seemed alive, the trees whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand. She paused to catch her breath, taking in the beauty of the sunset, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The view was breathtaking, but there was an underlying eeriness to the stillness of the place. By the time she reached the clearing where the tower stood, the sky was a deep, ink-eye blue, dotted with stars. Firewatch Tower 17 loomed before her, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. It was an old structure, its wooden beams weathered by countless storms. The tower creaked and groaned in the mountain breeze, a haunting symphony that sent chills down her spine. Rebecca climbed the rickety stairs, her flashlight casting flickering beams on the worn steps. The higher she climbed, the more the wind howled, as if trying to warn her away. She reached the top and stepped into the small, sparsely furnished room. A single cot, a wood stove, a desk with a radio, and large windows offering a panoramic view of the vast, dark wilderness below. It was both comforting and unnerving to be so far removed from civilization. She set about making the place her own, lighting a fire in the stove to ward off the chill and unpacking her gear. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The wind seemed to carry voices, faint and indistinguishable, but persistent. She shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination playing tricks on her. After all, she was alone out here, completely and utterly alone. Chapter 2. First Night. The first night in the tower was uneventful, but Rebecca found it difficult to sleep. She lay on the creaky cot, the sleeping bag pulled tight around her, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every creak of the tower, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the silence. Around midnight, she heard it, a faint, distant whisper, barely audible over the wind. Rebecca sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, but the sound was so soft it could have easily been the wind. It had a distinct cadence, almost like a chant, but she couldn't make out any words. She told herself it was just her imagination, the product of being in such an isolated place. Still, sleep eluded her, and she spent the rest of the night staring out into the darkness, her mind racing. The next few days followed a routine. Rebecca conducted her daily checks, logging any signs of smoke or fire in the vast forest below. She radioed the ranger station each morning to report her findings, but the conversations were brief, just standard procedure. She spent her free time reading, writing in her journal, and exploring the area around the tower. Despite her efforts to stay busy, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed to have eyes, hidden among the trees, following her every move. The whispers continued, growing slightly louder each night, but always remaining just out of reach, like a distant memory she couldn't quite grasp. Chapter 3. The Stranger. A week into her assignment, Rebecca was jolted awake by a loud bang. She grabbed her flashlight and peered out into the darkness. There, at the base of the tower, stood a figure. The light revealed a man, his clothes torn and dirty, his eyes wide with fear. He looked up at her, desperation etched on his face. "Please, help me," he cried, his voice cracking with terror. Rebecca hurried down the stairs, her heart racing. The man looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was matted, his face covered in scrapes and bruises. He clung to her, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. "They live in the trees, in the shadows. They took my friends, and now they're coming for me." Rebecca tried to calm him, but his terror was palpable, contagious. She led him inside, offering him water and a place to rest. He collapsed onto the floor, too exhausted to move, his eyes never leaving the window. As he lay there, his breathing heavy and erratic, Rebecca couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread. Who were they? What had driven this man to such a state of fear? That night, as the man slept fitfully, Rebecca kept watch. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at her for days intensified. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread, her eyes constantly scanning the dark forest below. Around midnight, she saw them figures moving among the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. They were tall, gaunt, and unnaturally silent. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moon's light in a way that sent shivers down her spine. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as they circled the tower, their movements eerily synchronized. She could hear the faint whispers again, growing louder and more insistent. She locked the door and windows, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The man woke with a start, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he said, his voice barely a whisper, echoing her own fears. Rebecca didn't sleep that night, her eyes glued to the forest, watching the figures as they moved silently through the trees. They never approached the tower, but their presence was a constant, oppressive weight on her mind. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. Chapter 4. The Visitors. As the sun rose, the figures vanished, melting back into the shadows of the forest. The man was still visibly shaken, his fear palpable. He refused to leave the tower, insisting that if he stepped outside, they would find him. Rebecca tried to contact the ranger station for help, but the radio was dead, only emitting static. They were cut off, isolated from the outside world. Days turned into weeks, and the man's condition worsened. He grew weaker, his fear consuming him from the inside out. He spoke in hushed tones about his friends, taken in the night, their screams echoing through the forest. He described eyes watching from the darkness, always watching, never blinking. Rebecca listened, her own fear growing with each passing day. The whispers became a constant presence, louder now, more distinct. She could almost make out words, fragments of a language that seemed both ancient and malevolent. She found herself unable to sleep, her nights spent staring into the dark forest, waiting for the figures to return. One night, as the man slept fitfully, Rebecca sat by the window, her flashlight clutched in her hand. She saw them again, the figures moving among the trees, their eyes glowing in the moonlight. They were closer this time, their movements more deliberate. She watched in horror as they circled the tower, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. The man woke with a start, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Rebecca felt a cold dread settle over her. She locked the door and windows, her hands trembling as she tried to block out the whispers. But they were inside her mind now, a constant, insidious presence that she couldn't escape. Chapter 5. The Disappearance. By morning, the figures had vanished once again, but the man's fear remained palpable. He refused to leave the tower, insisting that they would find him if he stepped outside. Rebecca tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, continuing her daily checks and logging her observations, but the unease that had settled over her was impossible to shake. One morning, Rebecca woke to find the man gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the tower. He had simply vanished. She searched the surrounding area, calling his name, but there was no response, only the oppressive silence of the forest. She tried to contact the ranger station again, but the radio was still dead. She was completely alone now, the weight of her isolation pressing down on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had taken him. that the figures had claimed him as they had claimed his friends. Rebecca's sanity began to fray. She could feel it slipping away, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They spoke of ancient rites, of blood and sacrifice, of souls trapped in the trees. She covered her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they filled her mind, driving her to the brink of madness. She tried to leave the tower, to descend the stairs and escape the cursed forest, but the steps seemed endless, the trees impenetrable. She was trapped, a prisoner of the tower and the malevolent forces that surrounded it. Chapter 6. The Descent into Madness. The days blended into each other, a never-ending cycle of fear and isolation. Rebecca's grip on reality weakened, the line between dreams and waking life blurring. She couldn't tell if the figures she saw were real or figments of her deteriorating mind. The whispers were a constant presence, a maddening chorus that never ceased. Her journal became a record of her descent into madness, filled with incoherent ramblings about shadows and whispers. She wrote about the figures, their glowing eyes, their inhuman movements. She wrote about the man who had appeared out of nowhere, his terror mirroring her own. And she wrote about the voices, the ancient, malevolent voices that filled her mind. One night, as the moon hung full and bright in the sky, the figures came closer than ever before. Rebecca could see their faces now twisted, inhuman, with eyes that burned with a cold, malevolent light. They circled the tower, chanting in a language she couldn't understand, but that filled her with dread. The whispers grew into a cacophony, drowning out her thoughts. The walls of the tower seemed to close in, the wood groaning under the weight of unseen forces. Rebecca felt a cold hand on her shoulder and turned to see one of the figures standing beside her, its eyes boring into hers. In that moment, she understood. The tower was a beacon, a lure for the lost and the damned. The figures were the spirits of those who had succumbed to the forest's call, trapped in an eternal cycle of torment. She was their latest victim, her soul doomed to join theirs in the darkness. With a final scream, Rebecca was pulled into the shadows, her mind shattering as she became one with the whispers, another lost soul in the cursed wilderness. Epilogue. Weeks later, a new ranger arrived to take over the watch. They found the tower abandoned, Rebecca's belongings scattered, and her journal filled with incoherent ramblings about shadows and whispers. The ranger dismissed it as the writings of a mind broken by isolation, another casualty of the unforgiving wilderness. But at night, as they stood watch, they couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from the forest, or the faint, almost imperceptible whispers carried on the wind. The tower creaked and groaned, the wind howled through the trees, and the new ranger felt a chill that went beyond the cold mountain air. And the cycle began anew.